Chasing China.
Ni hao and welcome back to Chasing China. I have to say, now after the first episodes, it feels normal again to say that, to welcome you to my podcast, and thank you so much for all the amazing feedback I received, for all the kind words and the comments. It really means a lot. And sometimes we just need to hear that in order to be motivated and to carry on with something. So thank you. And let's start with today's episode. I'm already very excited to talk about this topic. As announced, today we are talking about the differences I've noticed between Germany and China when it comes to pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. When I tell people that I gave birth in China, one of the first questions I get is, was it very different from Germany? And honestly, yes. But probably not in the way people expect, because the biggest differences are not just about the hospitals or doctors. They are about how two cultures think about birth, recovery, and also motherhood. So today I want to share the three biggest differences that really shape my experience. And before we dive in, I just want to add a small disclaimer. Everything I'm sharing in this episode is based on my own personal experience, what I've learned, heard, and also researched, because I never gave birth in Germany. I gave birth in China. So I can't speak from first-hand experience about the German system, but I've talked to many friends, read a lot, and compared both systems from that perspective. So this is not a perfect or complete comparison, so please don't hate me in the comments. It's simply my personal view on the differences. So during my time here in China, I actually collected many little differences. And for this episode, I put them into three categories. So the differences during and after birth and in general around the healthcare system and the mindset. Then the differences in how the postpartum is lived and treated. This is probably the most interesting part. And then to finish this episode, also the differences in, the family life afterwards. So let's start with, all around the birth and the healthcare. Yeah, one of the biggest differences between China and Germany is the role of medical care in general. In China, especially in private international hospitals like the one I was in, pregnancy is very close monitored. You usually have a strong focus on, the regular checkups, ultrasounds, monitoring the baby's growth, medical safety. And for me personally, this meant that I always felt like someone was watching, but not in a bad way. I had the feeling that if I had a question or a concern, there was always someone available. I could always schedule an appointment like a few hours ahead. And especially as a first-time mother, that gave me a lot of security. So in Germany, I think the system is traditionally much more focused on midwives. A midwife is not only there for birth itself, but can also, support you during pregnancy and especially after birth. So actually, they tell you to directly start looking for one when you know that you're pregnant, and it's not always so easy. But this is a different story for a different podcast. So again, the German approach often focuses more on building a relationship with the person over time, preparing emotionally for birth as well, the natural process, and the postpartum support at home. So I know that in Germany there are a lot of prenatal classes and courses you even do with your partner, where you have breathing exercises or even, spiritual preparation. So there's much broader approach and more options to prepare. And I think, this is one of the biggest cultural differences. In Germany, it's often asked, how can we support the mother throughout this process? And in China, you rather ask, how can we make sure everything is medically safe? And honestly, both approaches have their strengths. And one thing I really appreciate in China was how included my husband was. He was not just there for birth, he was part of the whole experience. He could stay with me, support me, and we could experience this first moments together as a family. As mentioned already in the last episode, we had a family room and my husband could stay there with me on the couch. And in Germany, partners, of course, are usually also allowed to be present during birth, but the experience depends really on the hospital, and family rooms and overnight stays for partners are not always guaranteed. But I guess that applies as well to the local healthcare system here in China. Oh, but I remember that it was not always normal that I had my husband directly next to me when we did ultrasounds. I think they handle intimacy very careful, and sometimes that meant that your husband doesn't see you that exposed. But I have no idea if that is something Chinese or just everywhere sometimes, and if I'm just very, open. But let's talk now about the last difference in this category, the hospital stay itself. So many things I already mentioned, that in China, for example, especially in the private hospitals, mothers often stay longer after giving birth. For people, that means 3 to 4 days with a natural birth, and with C-section, maybe a week or even longer. The nurses are available 24/7 and they help you a lot, and you really get time to recover and to learn. And in Germany, many women leave the hospital much earlier, at least from what I read and heard. After an uncomplicated birth, many mothers go home, sometimes even earlier. The difference here is that Germany has a very strong postpartum home care system. So the focus in Germany is the help afterwards at home and not in the hospital itself. So a midwife normally comes to your home and supports you with the breastfeeding, the baby weight checks, even the wound healing, and you also can ask them everything about the baby, and of course also the recovery after birth. So the difference is basically China has more support inside the hospital, and in Germany they try to support you at home after leaving the hospital. And there are also quite a few alternatives when it comes to give birth in Germany. In Germany, you can give birth in a hospital, in a birth center, or even at home. There's a lot of flexibility around that. In China, birth is much more hospital-based. Home births or birth centers do exist, especially in bigger cities, but they are quite rare, I guess. I never heard about them. I never get to know a person who did that, because most families choose the hospital because they value the medical safety. And I think this reflects a bigger cultural difference. In Germany, birth is often seen more as a natural life event where women are encouraged to trust their bodies and have more individual choices. In China, you also have the choices. Like, for example, around the 30th month in the hospital, they gave me like the birth plan and I could choose and tick boxes and tell them what I want. But in general, in China, birth is often viewed more as a medical event where safety, control, and professional support are the priority. And a very good example for that was, what I told you for my birth story, that after my baby was not gaining a lot of weight in the last weeks, they wanted to do an induction just to make safe that the baby can grow outside. But, neither approach is necessarily better. They simply reflect different cultural values and ideas about what makes a birth experience feel safe and positive. But of course, there are also differences in what happens after birth, so the postpartum period. And this is probably the most fascinating difference because it's not just medical, it's deeply cultural. In Germany, the postpartum period is often about, slowly getting back into life. You go outside, you take walks, you slowly become active again. There's support, but there's also this idea of gradually returning to normal life. Moreover, there are certain, postpartum programs and activities. As I mentioned with the prenatal part, they also offer it for postnatal. So they have, for example, pelvic floor training, special yoga classes, and, they encourage you to get back into life. But as I did not experience postpartum in Germany, I cannot go very deep into details here. But in China, there is a completely different concept. It's called yuèzi, sitting the month, it's called. And for about 30 to 40 days after birth, the focus is entirely on recovery. The idea is that the body has gone through something very intense and needs to rebuild, which is true. So during this time, mothers are encouraged to rest as much as possible, stay warm, eat nourishing food, avoid stress and also physical strain. And I want to go a little bit deeper into this idea of the sitting a month because it's honestly one of the most, fascinating parts of Chinese culture when it comes to motherhood. So traditionally, it's a period of around 30 days. Some people do it for 40 days, where the mother is expected to fully focus on recovery. And the key idea behind this is that birth is not just a beautiful moment, it's also a major physical event. And from a traditional Chinese medicine perspective, the body loses a lot of energy and blood during pregnancy and birth and becomes very vulnerable. So this period is about restoring balance, rebuilding strength, and protecting the body. And that's why there are quite a few traditional rules. For example, avoiding cold is a big one. Many women are told to avoid cold drinks, cold food, cold air, even things like air conditioning or walking barefoot. And the idea is that cold can enter the body and cause long-term problems later in life. Another important part is food. So meals during this time are very intentional, warm, nourishing, and often cooked with ingredients like ginger, dates, sesame oil, or bone broth. And there are even very traditional dishes like pork cooked with ginger and vinegar that are specially made for the recovery. And then there is the idea of rest. The mother is not supposed to cook, clean, or take care of household tasks. Her only job is to recover and bond with the baby. And I think this is like amazing. And that they can make it work here is like mind-blowing. The support usually comes from the family, like the mother or the mother-in-law, because they retire here pretty early. And usually when the woman gets a baby, at least one part of the family, like the mother or father, the mother-in-law or father-in-law, is not working anymore. So either the support comes from the family or from a professional postpartum helper called a yuèzi. So I already mentioned several times that, having a nanny here, which is called ai, is pretty normal. It's a part of the culture. And there are special types of nannies specialized on postpartum care. And these yuèzis can even live with the family for a month and help with everything. It's a very normal part for the Chinese culture that the nannies live with you. For me, when I first heard that, I felt a little bit uncomfortable with this thought, especially directly after birth when you want to enjoy this private, intimate time. I couldn't picture anyone living with us. But yeah, well, here it's a big part, and they take care of the baby, they cook, support with breastfeeding, and yeah, in general, guiding the parents. So it's kind of a stay-at-home midwife. And what I personally found very interesting is the mindset behind it. In China, the mother herself is seen as someone who needs care, not only the baby, which I found beautiful. Because in Germany, I think a lot of things revolve around the baby and if the baby is good and if the baby is getting everything. But there's the mom, and without the mom, there wouldn't exist the baby. And if the mother is not happy, the baby is also not happy. So it's a bit like happy wife, happy life, right? So again, in China, the mother herself is seen as someone who needs care. And I think that's something that can sometimes get a little bit lost in more Western approaches. But nevertheless, as nice as it sounds in China, there are some rules that felt very different, very restrictive for me, because I really cannot picture myself not going out and especially not exercising. I already knew that it will be a little bit hard on me to focus on my recovery and really take it slow and do not start too soon with, exercising or exhausting myself too much. So I really am happy that I had my husband at home who kind of occupied my mind and just helped me to take care of myself and my body. So the first days I really tried to stay at home, and I think after 1 or 2 weeks we went for a very little walk, very slow, and it felt amazing. But even though you should take it slow, I think the Chinese approach is a bit extreme, because not only in this sitting month they restrict exercise. In general, exercise is not a big part of Chinese culture. I noticed that during my pregnancy, where I still went to the gym almost every day, did yoga or some cardio with my big belly, and the Chinese people were watching me very carefully. And the same applies to the time after birth. Like after 6 weeks, when my doctor said I can slowly go back to my sport routine and do some light cardio, I went there with my baby, with this little carrier you can put on your body. And he always slept there. And he really enjoyed when I was moving on the stepper with this motion. I already mentioned to you that my baby needed a lot of movement and bouncing to fall asleep. So he loved it when I was in the gym doing some cardio and he could sleep. Yeah, that was hilarious. And you cannot imagine the Chinese people watching. It was very funny. So yeah, to summarize, I really appreciate this approach, this Chinese approach to also, take good care of the mom and taking it slow. But at the same time, I think being active, going out, get some fresh air is a big part of recovery that can help. So let's get to the next and the last part about the differences. Family life with a baby or toddler. So another difference I started noticing more and more is not just around birth, but what comes after. The life with a baby or toddler in China can feel quite different compared to Germany. In China, I often feel like there is more structure and support built into daily life. Many families have this additional help, whether it's the grandparents, a nanny, or, kindergarten starting earlier. And there's often a stronger focus on routines, sleep schedules, and early independence in certain areas. At the same time, I also noticed that society in general is very used to children. People are very open, very involved, and sometimes also very direct when it comes to giving advice. As I mentioned, these older Chinese grannies that watched me in a certain way when they saw that Luca was without socks. Yeah, in Germany, I feel like there's often more emphasis on individual parenting choices, more flexibility, more every family does it their own way. And there's also a strong focus on independence, but maybe in a different way, encouraging children to explore, to be outside, and to develop on their own pace. For example, because many of the children have their nannies, and the nannies get paid, so they clean after the kid. So what I observed quite often is that the kids, they just throw away their toys and walk away, and the nanny picks up everything after them. So I think in Germany, we have more the approach of teaching them being responsible quite early. In China, on the other side, what I could observe is that the parents really want to teach their children early in life some skills. So they send their children to some classes so early. Swimming classes, dancing classes, painting, even English classes very early in life. I think in our compound's pool, I saw a 2.5-year maybe being taught by a professional teacher on how to swim. I think that is fascinating, and I like the idea behind it, that they really want the best for their child and a good future. But in comparison to that, I think in Germany, we really focus on letting the kid be a kid, to give them a nice childhood, to be able to go out, to play, to get dirty, to play in the sun, and to, just enjoy the childhood. And sometimes I think that's missing here. But I can only see a glimpse of Chinese life and almost nothing from German life. But to summarize this difference, in China, raising a child can sometimes feel more like a shared responsibility. And in Germany, it's often more inside the family, and the family does it. And many families do not want their own parents, so the grandparents, to be involved too much. And both have their advantages. Sometimes it's nice to have more support, and sometimes it's nice to have more space to figure things out on your own. And again, it just shows that there is not one right way to raise a child. So, my personal conclusion. After experiencing birth in China, I honestly believe there is no perfect system. Germany has an incredible midwife culture and postpartum care at home. Plus, in general, a maybe more modern approach, especially when it comes to physical activity and the individualism. In China, on the other hand, especially in private hospitals, they offer a very high level of medical support and comfort, and they really focus on the mom's recovery, which I love. But in the end, the most important thing is not the system, it's whether you feel safe, supported, respected, understood. And I think in both countries, you can have an amazing birth experience and a very bad experience. So for me, giving birth in China was a very positive experience, and I'm so grateful. And at the same time, even though I have never given birth in Germany, I think I appreciate both systems, and I could picture myself also giving birth in Germany. But I also want to be completely honest and transparent. If you make me choose between a birth in a private hospital setting versus a public in Germany, I will probably choose the private one, simply because I loved feeling safe, and above all, the possibility of having a family room and the privacy for 4 full days. It was amazing, and I can't tell you how thankful I am. And I think that's what makes this experience so special. So, there it is. The biggest difference I observed, and I hope you like it. Thank you for listening, and see you next time. Bye bye.